All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this week's From the Field Farm Chat with Idaho Wheat. My name is Ryan Mortensen, and I am the Communications and Programs Manager for the Idaho Wheat Commission. This week, we are privileged to be joined by Dr. Alecia Kiszonas, a USDA-ARS Biologist and adjunct faculty member at Washington State University, specializing in crop and soil science, as well as food science. Um, Alecia's work focuses on evaluating wheat breeder samples and variety testing, and we are grateful and thankful for her time and joining us today. And Alecia, if you wouldn't mind, I'll just kind of turn the time over to you to kind of give us more of an in-depth outline and outlook of what you do. And for those who are participating, please during our From the Field, if you have a question, you can type it up in the chat or use the emoji feature to just raise your hand, or just take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask that question, and we will do our best to get it answered. So Alecia, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share a little bit about what we do here at the Western Wheat Quality Lab. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me see if this will let me. Okay, is that coming through okay?
It is, yes.
Okay. So as Ryan mentioned, I'm from the USDA, and we're on the WSU campus at the Western Wheat Quality Lab. So if you haven't been to our lab, we certainly enjoy visitors and giving tours. We also happen to be located in the same building as the Ferdinand's Creamery and Ice Cream Shop. So sort of an additional draw. I know that's why some of our visitors come just for the ice cream, which is understandable. So we've been in this facility since it was 1992, but the lab's been around since 1946. So we have folks in the cultivar development area as well as in the research area, and I lead the cultivar development team. So we've got a mixture of USDA and WSU folks, and most of the WSU folks are supported by the commissions and work we do. So we're very grateful for all of the commission support that we receive. So really our main mission is making sure that the wheat that we're exporting is of the highest quality. Our export customers have very high quality standards, and they pay more for our wheat as compared to buying Black Sea wheat, which is cheaper but lower quality. And so they pay quite a bit more for the wheat from this area. And we want to make sure we're maintaining and improving that high quality that they expect. We also really want to make sure that growers are getting the most value for their crop. So, making sure it's that high quality and that our export customers are, continue to be willing to pay those higher prices for that good quality, and really making sure we support the growers on that. We also aim to identify superior varieties that can be used as benchmarks in breeding programs or quality targets for release, and then develop those quality targets for each market class with the Pacific Northwest Wheat Quality Council. And primarily what I do on a day-to-day basis is provide data and interpretation to breeders and anyone else who calls and asks to assist their selections and their breeding program or pipeline. So we perform a number of tests here, and the samples come in a few different forms. The really main ones that a lot of people are aware of are the variety testing samples. So in the 3 states, so Washington, Oregon, and the North Idaho program, we collect samples from multiple locations, usually at least 5 locations per market class. And the varieties chosen are those that are new. We have a few check varieties, but mostly they're varieties that are new. Once a variety has gone into the preferred variety brochure, we no longer sample it so that we can make room for all of the newer varieties, named or experimental lines coming through. So we do that, and I make sure to get samples from locations that have a test weight that would qualify as US grade number 2 or better, and then protein that would be appropriate for the market class. So for soft wheat, we want lower protein. So I'm generally not going to sample a location that might have 14% protein for soft wheat, because that's likely not going to end up on a boat going over to our customers. So, kind of trying to keep that protein in its appropriate market class range. We start with grain cleaning and then measure main grain attributes, test weight, protein, moisture, and then the single kernel characterization system for grain hardness, which is really an important parameter in understanding the variation throughout a class, and then also tells us a lot about the milling properties that a given variety will have. We also measure polyphenol oxidase. And for those who aren't familiar with that enzyme, which I hadn't been, it's the same enzyme that causes browning of apples, bananas, lettuce, fruit, avocados, things like that. It's not harmful. It's just not visually appealing. And so in wheat, that can cause graying of the dough or specks in things like noodle products, and none of that is desirable. So we do this test, and the breeders are very receptive, especially to this test, because there are some very straightforward genes involved. And so it's a nice thing for them to be able to select on. Then we move on to milling, where we measure things like flour yield, break flour yield, flour ash, and milling score. And of course, those are all important parameters, not only for quality, but for economics on the milling side. So a miller wants to get the highest amount of flour yield with the lowest amount of flour ash possible. So it helps their kind of bottom line as well, and tells them how these varieties will perform, not only quality-wise, but for their profits. And then we measure, the flour lab is a pretty busy lab. They're all busy, but we measure flour protein and moisture, and along with that, the solvent retention capacity tests. And those are really important because there are a lot of very large polymers in wheat. So if we think about the carbohydrates in wheat, the starch, there are some non-starch carbohydrates, and then there's gluten, which is made up of 2 main protein types, the glutenins and the gliadins. And when we bake, which is absolutely critical, we might see a cookie is a little small, and that's great to know, but we also want to know what polymer system might be causing that. And so these solvent retention capacity tests help us to isolate just kind of one polymer system. So for example, the carbonate SRC is really a good measure of starch damage. So in soft wheat products, that would be a negative thing. We don't want a lot of starch damage from milling. And it only looks at that. The lactic acid SRC looks at gluten strength. And the sucrose SRC looks at some of those non-starch carbohydrates. as well as the gliadins a little bit. And the water SRC sort of pulls it all together into one picture. So it's a really important test that can be done early on in a breeding cycle so that breeders can, maybe select out material that has undesirable characteristics early on before they have, thousands of pounds of seed that they're hoping to get into releasing.
Alecia, can you tell us what key characteristics you're looking for when you are evaluating a wheat sample?
Yeah, so for soft wheat, I look most closely at break flour yield, flour protein, and then the water SRC. And I want nice high break flour yield, which is really the finest, softest, most high quality flour. And the water SRC really gets at that water absorption. And for soft wheat products, for most soft wheat products, we want very low water absorption. I use Oreo cookies a lot as a good example because they're a very dry product. So if we think about them both from a textural standpoint and a shelf life standpoint, they're very, very dry. Not so much the cream filling, but so we don't want a lot of water to be absorbed because that water has to be baked out. So the more water a flour will absorb, the longer it needs to be baked out or in the oven, which can create stress fractures in the cookies, which basically means every cookie will just be broken, and no one wants broken Oreos. And it also increases the likelihood that a product will be kind of burned or have that burned taste. So those are really the main sort of flour parameters I look at. And then, of course, when we get into cookies, of course, we want to see a nice large cookie diameter, a nice large cake. And I've indicated here, cookies and cakes are soft wheat products, and hard wheat is really used for bread. And so things like the mixograph measure the kind of dough characteristics involved in mixing and how strong or weak the dough might be, and helps really predict what the loaf of bread will look like. And then we bake pup loaves of bread, which are tiny 100-gram loaves of bread. And we measure volume, and that's really a great way to evaluate how a bread flour might do commercially. Our bread doesn't look the exact same, but it's a really good model in the way that I would never try to sell the cookies that we bake in the lab. As soon as they cool, they are rock hard and they taste okay, but really they're a great model. And if a flour bakes a good cookie, it's actually going to bake a good product for any other soft wheat product. The exception might be crackers, but that's a whole different chemistry. So those are kind of the main things that we look at. And we do noodles as well, kind of by request. And we do other things like pasta as a research tool. So just to kind of give an example of sort of the scale, we take samples from all of the variety testing programs. And then we also collect samples from breeders. And we don't put any limits on these numbers of samples. So folks are free to submit as many samples as they would like. We don't cap that. And so we end up, this year's a little higher than average with about 4,900, almost 5,000 samples, along with some additional new sampling we've done. We have a micro mill, and there are 2 in the world, and they were built specifically for us, and one was sent to Japan. And it can mill 5 grams of grain. So what you would maybe get from a hedgerow out in the field. And so that's used a lot for selection in an early stage of breeding. We get most samples at the F5 generation in breeding. So kind of 5 generations after that cross, we can test the micromilled samples at an earlier generation, maybe F3, F4, which means that the breeder can select out undesirable varieties before it goes to a larger scale plot trial, which is much more resource intensive. So the earlier we can get information to breeders about making those selections, the better. And so we tried kind of a new program with that this year, with micromilling these samples and running water SRC. And it was a really successful program and helpful for the breeders to make those decisions. Breeders have 8 million things they have to select for: yield, plant height, growing region, disease resistance, all these different things. And if we can give them quality data early on, it makes their lives easier as well, to be able to get rid of material that may have poor quality, instead of it being just about ready for release and finding out that, you know, maybe it's not kind of up to par with the other varieties in this region. So that's sort of the scope of what we work on as far as our day-to-day testing. And hopefully people are familiar with the preferred variety list, and all of that variety testing material goes into creating this preferred variety list with classifications. I've seen, you know, it's great that there are preferred variety lists in other areas. I like that we categorize ours instead of just a ranking list. And those categories are really set in collaboration with the 3 wheat commissions, so that, you know, they're really putting the priority on where the quality is, and sort of if they want to tighten the screws a little bit on quality, things like that. So this was last year's preferred variety brochure. And we see a lot of really nice, you know, most desirable and desirable varieties out there, which is fantastic and really what we like to see. The brochure for this year has been published. So if you don't have any copies, I know it's online, but also I'm sure the Idaho Wheat Commission can help you get a hold of some. And this is really one of our main ways of communicating with a lot of folks at one time. So we want to communicate these things to seed dealers, growers, quality labs, milling and baking companies, so that, and, you know, the commissions, of course, as well. And we would never ask a grower to sacrifice yield. However, they usually know 1 or 2, maybe 2 to 3 varieties that might work best in their growing environment, based on rainfall, soil, disease pressure, you know, things like that. And we ask that folks pick the one that's higher up on this list. So we're not sacrificing yield at all, but we're just asking that people grow the one that's higher quality. And that really helps to maintain that high quality throughout the region, because we may have a ship loaded with just one region, and if poorer quality varieties are being grown, and a lot of it, our customers aren't quite so thrilled about that. So it's important that we have really high qualities throughout the area being grown to continue to meet those customer expectations. We had quite a few new varieties this year added to the list. And I always like to go through these because I like to see a lot of them, they're in these higher quality groupings. And really, you know, I know the breeders that I work with are always very interested in where's the variety going to fall on the list, and what category it might get. And really, you know, I know there are some programs that release only if they're going to be desirable or most desirable. And I think that's, you know, important that they take quality into account so strongly, as well as all the other factors that, you know, a variety has to have great yield and things like that. So, it's sort of a unique region in that aspect where quality is so heavily prioritized along with all the agronomic properties. And those data also go into things like the cereal variety release committees, at least for WSU. And then they're in the certified seed buying guide. So I'll talk just a little bit about the Wheat Quality Council as well, which is a lot of fun every year. And if folks haven't gone to that, they definitely should. So in the fall, I asked the breeders in the area, public breeders, private, any breeders can submit grain samples to us. We limit it at about 40, and we take about 150 pounds of each variety, and we mill it on our pilot scale mill. And so we get, 100 some pounds of flour, and we submit that to about 25 different cooperators. And these are milling companies, baking companies, other quality labs, both public and private. And then we have international collaborators. So we work with US Wheat Associates, and they choose 2 international collaborators every year to participate. And so we send this flour out, and everyone does their standard lab tests and evaluates the material kind of based on their needs and their perspectives. And then we all get together in January and we talk about the results. And the breeders are typically there. And so they get this feedback from the customers, the actual, folks who are using the material, as well as all the other quality labs. And it's really a great time for people to ask questions and understand more and collaborate. And then having our international participants is great because they give the broader perspective of what the needs of their milling and baking companies are. We have technical presentations as well, and a lot of kind of social time. It's a fun group, and a lot of people who've been there have been attending for at least a decade, some closer to 2 decades. It's a really fun meeting and a great opportunity to just talk about regional issues in quality and regional needs, as well as, trying to make sure we're kind of communicating those same messages back to breeders and seed dealers and things about what's really helpful for customers. And then also listening to their concerns about maybe how the environment is impacting quality and things like that. So we can get everybody together and kind of seeing everybody's perspective.
Sure. Alecia, I had this question from one of our commissioners in Southeast Idaho that I want to ask, and I'm going to read it just to make sure I get it right.
Sure.
He said, wheat quality is 2/3 environment and 1/3 variety. On the other hand, flour quality is 2/3 variety and 1/3 environment. Can you expound on that a little bit for our farmers?
Yeah. I haven't heard that kind of fraction breakdown before, but I would say there's a lot of truth to that. So things like grain quality, a lot is, things like test weight and protein are certainly much more heavily influenced by environment, particularly protein, of course. So those grain properties and going into those milling properties are often pretty heavily environmentally controlled. We do tend to see the same varieties that are, in ranking wise, if a variety has good test weight at some locations, it's likely to be high in all locations. The absolute values might shift up and down a little bit. So I think that's a pretty accurate statement for grain, and I think similarly for flour properties. Their protein does make a difference in end use quality for flour, but it's also a lot of those heritable traits that of a good variety is going to stand out as good no matter where it's grown. and a poor variety the same thing. And a lot of that is maybe starch structure and protein, like the genetics of the proteins in wheat, in the glutenins. And so it's, I like that ratio. That's interesting. And I think that that does have a lot of merit. And I think that really is probably ultimately why we have so much more flower testing that we do, because that's something we can feed that information back to the breeder to help them with those selections. If all of it was completely environmentally controlled, I think we would have a much different system for kind of production and communication. But because there is that huge genetic component, we're able to give all that information to the breeder to make those decisions, and hopefully, you know, kind of take out a little bit of that environmental challenge with it.
Hi, Alecia. Would you describe a little bit more about the preferred variety list and the data that you've got going into it?
Sure.
The t-tests, I think, are fairly unique compared to the rest across the country. Now, granted, I've argued with Doug about the weighting of parameters in the t-tests, and some of that is a bit arbitrary, I know. But it has been a good general rule of thumb and data to back up your decisions and categories in the preferred variety list.
Yeah, thank you. So the first thing I'll say about the preferred variety list is that every market class has a check variety, and that check variety is grown in the same field in the same year as whatever, you know, experimental lines we're looking at. And that's really critical because we know that, you know, environmental factors change so much, and we want to have really fair head-to-head comparisons of varieties with the check variety. So we gather all of the variety testing data, and for soft wheat, it's the kind of most straightforward example to use. 10% of the score, the overall score, is made up of grain properties, 40% by milling properties, and 50% by flour and baking properties. And so in the, especially flour properties, that's the break flour yield, which of course we know is so important for quality and also for kind of the bottom line in a milling operation, as well as the milling score, which takes into account ash. And baking companies tend to have pretty strict flour ash specifications, and that does seem to be very genetically controlled. So that's a parameter that's very important also in kind of, will this variety make flour spec to sell to a baking company? In the kind of the baking and flour parameters are things like the cookie diameter and flour protein, along with that water SRC for that low water absorption that's desired. So we do use that all together, and it goes into one score, and really the weighting of it, and I know there's some you know, different perspectives on that, really comes from the council itself. We didn't set the weights on that, and I think that's important that it's from input based on a lot of labs, and the commissions really set the classifications, which is also, I think, really making sure that the commissions have that strong voice in how they see kind of trends in the market and where they would like to kind of emphasize quality in different ways. And so you know, it's not, certainly I think no system is perfect, but I do think it's a really good way to incorporate all different aspects of wheat quality instead of focusing simply on just the cookie diameter or just the break flour yield. But it really gets at this whole process of, is this variety also likely to make US grade number 2 or better at the elevator? You know, if it consistently has a high test weight and things like that, and maybe it has a nice low protein, so that there isn't going to be, that protein discount and things like that. So I think it's overall a pretty decent metric, and I definitely don't, parse it out kind of this variety is 0.2 better than this, but I think in general, kind of following that trend of higher up on the list being higher quality is a really good rule of thumb.
So question about what you're hearing from the industry these days, because over the years, especially from overseas customers, I, as a breeder, kept hearing, we really like soft wheat quality. Don't screw it up. Don't change it. Okay. You go into the Wheat Quality Council, of course, and there's never 100% agreement on anything. Okay. Every company has a different priority, a different product, something different they're looking at. So what are you hearing from the industry these days, both domestic and export, about the quality of the PNW wheats and what directions we need to go or not?
I'm hearing that we may have competition. Not necessarily in club wheat. I don't think anybody else is going to grow club wheat ever. But that a lot of folks are still very much wanting to make sure that we stay moving forward in that quality. And we have some technical exchanges that try to get to that, where our collaborators are just brutally honest if they don't like certain varieties or certain things, which is really helpful. And so I think part of it is also consistency. And, we know and they understand about how there is that major environmental effect on protein is the big one. That's the biggest concern. And we know that just varies quite a bit based on the environment. But I think one thing I'm hearing a lot of is, are there certain varieties or traits that are more stable across different environmental stressors? Now, no variety is going to be identical, whether it's grown in an area with 10 inches of rainfall a year versus an irrigated system, but some are more consistent than others. And so I think what we're hearing is wanting more of that consistency. I had somebody from one of the major Japanese milling companies email me and say, I'm worried about your soil moisture. And I said, I understand, or winter kill or things like that. And so, the folks at these big companies really do track things like our weather. And I think they want to know how we can get the most consistent, keep it as similar as possible in that high quality range. If it bounces around a lot for them, it's really difficult for keeping their formulations consistent. And we see the same thing with domestic companies. They'll say, this quarter things looked like this, and we got this many calls about they didn't like this product. And, so I think, and if people didn't know that, food companies take customer calls very, very seriously. They track it, they track what people's issues were, and then they go to the source of the flour and they say, what happened? So I think it's, the customers are very finely tuned to those quality aspects. And so these companies are also very finely tuned to that, and having that consistency is most important.
No, I agree. The consistency in some ways is probably more important than whether you're in the desirable to most desirable range. That consistency, so that the customer knows what he's going to get, can predict, can adjust properly, is really, really important. But it also comes back to our small scale tests still don't really get us 100% of the way there to an industrial product. And so, I think it's really good. The data that's shared by the lab is tremendous. The t-tests are really good communications to the growers, and that feedback from the industry through the Wheat Quality Council, you can't replace it. I mean, the discussions there, the information exchanges, the directions the companies are going that you get to hear from their mouth is really important in helping the breeders decide the directions they need to take in the quality specs as well. Again, you don't want to mess it up, you don't want to screw it up, but quality is still, it's not perfect. We get as close as we can with the tests we have.
I agree. And, along with the Quality Council, we have two other major technical exchanges with international partners, one with Japan and one with Thailand. And we're adding another, I think, this year, hopefully, where, we're all just kind of brutally honest about what they see in the quality and what they like and don't like. And that's so important, like you said, and our MEOG mill for the Quality Council gets closer to that industry type of milling. But it's also, really helpful to get that feedback from folks who are baking these products day in, day out and selling them. Like I said, we'd never try to sell our sugar snap cookies, but they correlate pretty well with what customers are trying to sell. So I think that feedback is really critical for us to make sure that we're continually kind of calibrated, and then also for the breeders to hear on that larger scale.
All right. Well, we are a little over a 30-minute mark, which is totally fine, Alecia. Thank you so much for that information. We are so thankful for the work that you do with the variety testing, with the preferred variety list, with the Wheat Quality Council on behalf of Idaho wheat growers. Thank you. And thank you for your time today and sharing that with us. For those of you watching, we will be posting this webinar on our social media platforms, as well as our website and YouTube and podcast platforms. That will be posted here within the next day or two, so feel free to share those links with anybody that you feel might be interested in hearing this information. And then join us back here in a couple weeks for another From the Field. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.